You pick up a box of cereal in the grocery store aisle, flip it to the side, and instantly read the exact amounts of sugar, fat, and calories. It is an action you perform daily, trusting the black and white grid to tell you exactly what you are putting into your body. But the standardized, mandatory nutrition label you rely on today was not introduced until 1990. Before that specific year, what you were allowed to know about your food was largely dictated by corporate marketing departments. Navigating a supermarket meant walking through a landscape of wild health claims, hidden ingredients, and deliberate legal obfuscation. How did a nation go from eating completely in the dark to establishing a universal system of dietary transparency? The answer is a story of a decades-long war between public health advocates, powerful food lobbies, and the federal government over who controls the truth about what we eat. The battle for food transparency begins in an era of terrifying uncertainty. At the dawn of the 20th century, the American food supply was rapidly shifting from local farms to distant, large-scale factories. Shoppers began buying canned vegetables, bottled syrups, and processed meats with absolutely no way to verify what was actually inside the tin. The primary concern during this industrial boom was not counting calories or tracking vitamins, but basic survival. Unscrupulous manufacturers routinely bulked up their products with cheap, dangerous fillers to maximize profits and undercut honest farmers. The federal health reports from this period documented milk thinned with dirty water and chemically colored with yellow dye. Investigators also found processed meats preserved with toxic formaldehyde being sold to unsuspecting urban families. The public outcry over these poisoned foods led to the passage of the Pure Food and Drug Act in 1906. This landmark legislation was the government's first serious attempt to bring order to the chaotic and deadly food industry. However, the law was incredibly limited in its scope regarding actual public knowledge and dietary education. The government enforcement ledgers of the era focused entirely on testing for illegal adulterants and dangerous chemicals rather than nutritional value. The new regulations merely prevented manufacturers from printing blatant lies on their packaging. They were not required to disclose a single ingredient, let alone explain whether the food was actually good for your long-term health. For decades, this low standard of simple non-toxicity remained the absolute limit of federal food law. But by the 1930s, the scientific understanding of the human body was undergoing a radical and rapid transformation. Researchers in laboratories across the country were identifying specific vitamins, isolating minerals, and mapping the exact role that calories played in human health. The Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of 1938 updated the old rules to address these new scientific realities. If a food company wanted to claim their product cured a specific ailment, the law now required them to provide actual clinical proof. Yet for the vast majority of everyday groceries, the actual nutritional makeup remained a closely guarded corporate secret. The legal briefs filed by major food conglomerates fiercely defended their recipes as proprietary intellectual property. Industry lawyers successfully argued that forcing a factory to print its recipe on a label would instantly destroy its competitive advantage. The law agreed, meaning a shopper buying a loaf of factory bread still had no legal right to know what was actually baked into the dough. This legal shield held firm even as the post-war economic boom radically transformed the American diet. The 1950s and 60s saw supermarkets flooded with entirely new categories of heavily processed, shelf-stable convenience foods. Families were suddenly consuming artificial colors, synthetic flavors, and chemical preservatives that had no equivalent in the natural world. Shoppers were navigating aisles packed with brightly colored boxes, boasting vague promises of energy and vitality. Yet underneath the cardboard marketing, the physical products possessed zero hard data for a mother trying to feed her children. The growing disconnect between corporate marketing fantasies and the grim reality of public health finally reached a breaking point. In the winter of 1969, the White House convened a massive, unprecedented conference on food, nutrition, and health. The administration brought together scientists, industry leaders, and consumer advocates to address a sudden rise in dietary diseases. The goal was to figure out why a nation with the most abundant food supply in history was becoming increasingly sick. The official policy transcripts from that historic gathering declared for the very first time that consumers had a fundamental right to know what they were eating. The resulting government guidelines proposed a new framework where companies could voluntarily list calories and a few basic vitamins on their packaging. It was a revolutionary concept for the industry, but because it relied entirely on the goodwill of massive corporations, it was ultimately doomed to fail. The voluntary system introduced in the early 1970s proved to be a masterclass in corporate evasion. In 1973, the Food and Drug Administration published its first official guidelines for a standardized nutrition information panel. However, this new rule contained a massive, intentional loophole designed to protect industry profits. The 1973 Federal Register explicitly stated that printing the label was entirely optional unless a manufacturer added artificial nutrients or made a specific health claim on the box. If a company simply stayed quiet about their ingredients, they could keep their nutritional data completely hidden. Consequently, the vast majority of junk food remained completely untracked and legally obscure. For the few products that did carry the new panel, the government-required format focused heavily on preventing vitamin deficiency rather than chronic disease. The mandatory reporting ledgers forced manufacturers to list percentages of the recommended daily allowance for obscure micronutrients like riboflavin and thiamine. Meanwhile, critical metrics like total sugar, saturated fat, and dietary cholesterol were routinely buried or completely omitted. As America entered the 1980s, this disjointed regulatory framework collided with a massive cultural shift toward fitness and dieting. Shoppers suddenly cared deeply about cutting calories and reducing their fat intake to prevent heart attacks. The food industry recognized this anxiety not as a public health crisis, but as an incredibly lucrative marketing opportunity. Supermarket shelves were quickly flooded with products boldly declaring themselves to be light, lean, and natural. Because the federal government had never legally defined these specific marketing terms, companies could use them with absolute impunity. A manufacturer could simply slice a piece of fatty cheese slightly thinner and legally market the resulting product as a revolutionary diet food. The true breaking point for regulatory oversight arrived in the fall of 1984. The Kellogg Company launched an aggressive national television and print campaign for its all-brand cereal, explicitly claiming the high-fiber product could help prevent cancer. The company partnered with the National Cancer Institute to endorse the claim, completely bypassing the established authority of the Food and Drug Administration. This unprecedented marketing maneuver triggered absolute chaos within the federal government. For decades, claiming a product could prevent a disease automatically classified it as a drug, which required years of rigorous clinical trials. But the federal regulators, caught in an era of intense political deregulation, ultimately blinked and allowed the cereal boxes to stay on the shelves. The floodgates immediately burst open across the entire grocery sector. Overnight, Oat Bran was crammed into potato chips, muffins, and cookies, all carrying wildly exaggerated promises of miraculous heart health. Shoppers were bombarded by contradictory health claims, completely unable to verify if a sugary snack was actually a medical breakthrough or just clever advertising. The human consequences of this corporate deception became impossible for the medical community to ignore. In 1988, the United States Surgeon General released a massive, comprehensive report detailing the direct link between the modern American diet and deadly chronic illnesses. The official government health statistics proved that high intakes of saturated fat and sodium were directly fueling an epidemic of heart disease and diabetes. The scientific consensus was finally clear, but the public was still trying to navigate a grocery store built on deliberate deception. Consumer advocacy organizations began aggressively lobbying Congress, arguing that basic dietary facts could no longer be treated as a corporate luxury. They demanded a total overhaul of the law, insisting that every single packaged food carry a strictly defined universal label. The momentum finally shifted when individual state legislatures decided they could no longer wait for federal action. Several states began drafting their own strict, independent labeling laws to protect their local citizens from predatory food marketing. The major food conglomerates suddenly faced the logistical nightmare of printing 50 different wrappers for a single box of crackers, forcing them to finally beg Congress for a unified national standard. A fierce legislative battle erupted on Capitol Hill as powerful agricultural lobbies fought desperately to shape these proposed transparency mandates. Meat and dairy conglomerates spent millions of dollars arguing that mandatory fat disclosures would confuse consumers and bankrupt small farmers. The fight over what you were allowed to know about your dinner was about to culminate in the most significant food law of the 20th century. The looming threat of 50 conflicting state laws finally broke the industry's resistance in Washington. In November of 1990, Congress passed the Nutrition Labeling and Education Act. This sweeping legislation fundamentally destroyed the era of voluntary corporate disclosure. The meat and dairy lobbies fought bitterly until the very last minute to secure massive exemptions for their specific industries. Consequently, the final legal text completely exempted fresh produce and raw cuts of meat from the mandatory labeling requirements. But for the vast empire of processed packaged foods, the era of total secrecy was officially over. The law handed the Food and Drug Administration the monumental task of designing a universal label for nearly every boxed and canned item in America. The newly appointed agency commissioner, David Kessler, viewed this not just as a regulatory chore, but as a crucial public health intervention. The goal was to create a tool so simple and undeniable that corporate marketing departments could no longer hide the truth. The first mechanical hurdle was eliminating the deceptive practice of manipulating serving sizes to hide massive calorie counts. The federal compliance manuals mandated exact, standardized gram measurements for every single specific food category. A manufacturer could no longer claim their soda was low in sugar by pretending a normal person only drank 3 ounces. Next, regulators had to engineer the physical appearance of the data so it could be instantly understood in a crowded grocery aisle. The agency collaborated with private graphic designers to establish the rigid, black and white grid known as the Nutrition Facts Panel. This stark, unbranded architecture forced every company to present their data in the exact same bold, legible font, stripping away all marketing distractions. Finally, the agency completely overhauled the actual nutritional metrics to target modern chronic diseases rather than historical vitamin deficiencies. The new regulatory codebooks introduced a standardized 2,000-calorie baseline to calculate exact daily percentages for fat, sodium, and carbohydrates. This mathematical anchor allowed a shopper to instantly see if a frozen dinner wiped out their entire sodium allowance for the day. When the universal labels finally hit supermarket shelves in 1994, the food industry faced a brutal reckoning. Companies were suddenly forced to publicly confess exactly how much saturated fat and sodium they had been pumping into their best-selling products. Thousands of iconic snacks had to be quietly reformulated in factory kitchens because their original recipes looked too horrifying when printed in stark black and white. However, the massive food conglomerates quickly learned how to adapt to this new era of mandatory transparency. Corporate food scientists shifted their focus to exploiting the remaining blind spots in the 1990 legislation. For decades, the law failed to distinguish between naturally occurring sugars and heavily refined industrial syrups added during manufacturing. This specific loophole allowed brands to market incredibly sugary yogurt and cereal as healthy breakfast options for children. It took until 2016 for the government to finally force companies to explicitly declare added sugars on a separate, dedicated line of the grid. The battle for absolute dietary truth remains a constant, evolving war between public health mandates and corporate profit margins. Today, the Nutrition Facts panel is one of the most reproduced and recognized graphic designs in human history. We flip a box over and scan the grid without ever thinking about the decades of legal battles and political compromises that put it there. That simple black and white rectangle represents a monumental transfer of knowledge, taking the power of information away from the factory and handing it to the citizen. As food companies continue to invent new synthetic ingredients, should the government dictate even stricter warning labels on the front of the box? Or is it ultimately your personal responsibility to turn the package around and read the raw data? Subscribe to our channel to continue investigating the hidden architectures and untold histories of the everyday systems that quietly govern your life.